Welcome to the World of Eora, a news and lore podcast about the Pillars of Eternity games, as well as Obsidian Entertainment's upcoming release, Avowed. Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of the World of Eora. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. Thanks everyone for joining me as we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics for Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 as we gear up for the release of Avowed. And for those of you new to the show wondering why we pair Pillars of Eternity and Avowed together, it's because they share the same fantasy setting known as Eora. So as the theory goes, if we dive into Pillars of Eternity, we can learn more about the world Avowed is set in and appreciate the game and all its nuances when it releases, as well as just enjoy good lore from a couple of great games. Since Avowed has had a gameplay trailer recently, I've been thinking a lot more about things to focus on that might be related to that game in particular. And one thing that comes to mind is the idea of the Undead, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Whenever you dive into fantasy TV shows, fantasy books, or fantasy video games, Undead is something of a trope that we run into a lot. We're pretty used to by now, us video gamers out there, running into undead skeletons as one of your basic enemies that you fight firsthand and just become mobs and ads by the end of the game. Just the small enemy that you beat up with one hit of your sword. They're pretty minor, and not many of us think much beyond that because we're so used to seeing them. But in any of these fantasy worlds that exists, the skeletons that we see walking around, the undead creatures that we see wandering in the dark that we have to face down, there's a lore reason to why they exist. Not just in Eora, in any fantasy world, because, undead aren't normal, so there has to kind of be a fantasy-related reason for it. Sometimes it's as simple as, fantasy magic. Things happen and there you go. There's not really much of an explanation. But in some fantasy worlds, there's a long-standing and large reason behind why undead exist. And in the world of Eora, as we see in Pillars of Eternity and Avowed, there is such justification for the existence of undead. And so join me, will you, in today discussing the undead, how they're created, and what they really are.
I'm curious. What exactly did you find there?
A lot of today's lore can be found on Pillars of Eternity fandom's website, or if you have Pillars of Eternity 1 or 2, you can go into the bestiary and look up the relevant articles in the encyclopedia there, or if you happen to have a digital or hard copy of either of the lore books for the first two Pillars of Eternity games, then you can look up the relevant bestiary information there. But that's mostly where we're going to be getting the information from. Again, the main reason I'm wanting to focus on this is because in the reveal trailer for Avowed and in the gameplay trailer for Avowed, we've seen lots of instances of undead creatures. And so it looks like we're going to be fighting them firsthand at multiple points throughout the game. So it might help to understand what the undead are and how they can come about. Now, I should note, I'm going to take one particular line of thinking within this game's world of how the undead come about, but there are technically other ways, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. A lot of this information comes from looking at the entry on skeletons on Pillars of Eternity Wikipedia, the fandom website. In this article, we see here laid out the life cycle of the skeleton. And I don't know, life cycle is probably not a good word considering it doesn't really cycle up. It just sort of ends. But anyways, skeletons, as you see them wandering around in the world, they generally didn't start out that way. They didn't just bore out of the ground, animated out of nowhere. They actually generally started as a living, breathing person. Now, that might sound obvious, but I mean, they started out as an undead kind of living person. I guess they're still technically not alive. Let me start over. Skeletons are the end result of a long period of decay that start out with something called vampires. A vampire is a mostly recently alive person, but has since then died. And they are undead in the sense that their body is dead, and it is dying, and it is decomposing, but their soul is still attached to their corporeal form, and so they still have that essence, that energy animating their body, but their body is dead and dying. And so that process of decay is what eventually leads to the skeletons that you see and fight throughout the game, but they don't start out that way. They start as recently deceased. And so we're going to start this off by talking about how this happens in the first place. So an undead creature is classified as a vessel creature. And simply put, what's going on is that you have a body, and in this body is a soul. And when normally a creature in the world of Eora dies, the soul will leave the physical body and then go to the beyond, and then come back later, because it's a cycle of reincarnation. But there are certain instances where the soul doesn't leave the body, but the body has still died. And so in that sense, you have this dead body with a life soul in it. And that is where the undead come from. That is how undead happen. Now, there are a number of ways that this can occur in the world of Eora. The most common way, however, is done through animancy, which is the science of the soul. So that's the scientific academic field of studying the soul itself. Undead creatures can be created as a result of animancy, either on purpose or by accident. Some people might want to do it on purpose as a way to try to extend their life indefinitely or just longer, because people will want to live longer than their natural lifespan will let them, and they're willing to undergo experimentation to try to find ways to do that. Most of the time it doesn't work out. You don't really truly live forever. You just end up becoming an undead, and then you become a skeleton, and it doesn't go well for you. But people are still willing to try. Those who are bold and brave and, all for science, or, or all for yourself, depending on what it is that you're going for. That's how a lot of undead can be created. Now, this same thing can occur organically speaking. If it's done through animancy, this is mechanically done. The animancer is the one performing the experiment and causes this result to happen. But it can happen organically. And when it happens organically, then it actually has a better outcome for the individual. You learn this when you look at the lore for a Death Guard, which is a particular type of enemy that you might face in the Pillars of Eternity games. And these are creatures or people that have, by some means or another, naturally cause their soul to stay affixed to their physical body, usually by just pure strength of will, by having like some unfinished business that they just cannot let go of, and they can't let go of it so powerfully that their soul actually refuses to move on and leave the body, and it stays attached. And they become a Death Guard, which maintain all of their rationality and maintain all of their will, etc., whereas vampires and other kinds of undead, especially ones that are made by animancers, they will undergo a process of decay which will leave them kind of like mentally bankrupt. There's nothing there up in the brain. They're just these aggressive, instinctive creatures by the end of the cycle. There are other ways of doing this as well. For instance, if an animancer creates an undead creature, and at some point in the process of decay, a wizard might use arcane methods to halt the process of decay, to stop them from going down that decomposition chain any further. There is also the ability to create yourself into being a lich, which, if you've been involved in fantasy and any amount of time, you've probably heard of a lich, which is like the uber undead. It's the super strong undead guy who will live forever and still maintains all of their rational faculties. And there is ways to become a lich in the world of Eora, but I'm not going to go through it on today's episode. Suffice it to say that it has its own kind of classification and its own methods on how to do it. Though it is still technically an undead, it's not kind of falling under the purview of what we're going to talk about here. So, okay, I talked about where the undead come from. You have a body with a soul in it. The body dies. The soul doesn't leave the body for whatever reason. But why then, when we run into the undead out there, are they such mindless and aggressive creatures? Like, why do all undead just have to, attack you and eat you alive like zombies or something like that? Well, that is because, just like you and me are alive, we have a self-preservation state. We have this thing inside of us that tells us, hey, I want to be alive. I don't want to die. So I'm going to do things to keep myself alive, such as sleep, drink water, eat food, etc., right? And in a way, the undead have the same thing, except they're not trying to stay alive. They're just trying to stave off more and more decomposition. So how it works is that when an undead is created, they begin the process of decomposing. And this ultimately leads to kind of, I would call it a horrible fate. They just become, like I said, mindless, animalistic, instinctive creatures that have no rationality whatsoever, no consciousness. But to stave that process, to slow it down, what an undead creature can do is that they can consume the flesh of the living. Now, I know that sounds grotesque and dark, but hear me out how this works. So infused in your living body and mine would be the soul, and the soul is made up of something called essence, right? And in order to stave off decomposition, an undead creature needs to consume and suffuse their physical body with that living essence. When they do that, it staves off the decay, it slows it down. So by eating the flesh of the living, they slow the decomposition process down because they've ingested and they suffuse their body with that living life force, that essence. And so that's why the undead do what they do. Now, there are 5 stages within this mainline path of the undead. You start off as a vampire, which sounds a lot like vampire, and it's got some similarities to vampire, by the way, but it's vampire, Fampyrs. I suppose the similarity with regular vampires is that they, feed on the life force of the living. But I don't think that they don't have a reflection in mirrors, for example. I don't think they're allergic to garlic, and I'm pretty sure they can go out in the daylight. I don't know. Maybe I'll dive into the lore a little bit more, find out I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure the name just sounds familiar. But anyways, vampires are the first stage in this process of decay, followed by dargles, then ghouls, revenants, and finally skeletons. And we'll go into each step and talk about what they are. So, starting off in the first part of this undead chain, the vampire. I'm reading this from the Pillars of Eternity 2 guidebook. Vampires are kith that have had their lives unnaturally extended. Though retain most of the normal humanoid appearance, they are merely a few missed meals away from devolving into mindless monstrosities, and they know it. As vampires maintain individual personalities and memories, this morbid knowledge may manifest itself in a number of ways. Some may become reclusive and cautious, avoiding any threats that could prematurely weaken or destroy them. Others become outgoing hedonists, seeking to enjoy every pleasure the world has to offer while they can. Sooner or later, every vampire will inevitably succumb to the decay unless killed. Because vampires require living essence in order to stay alive, and the blood of kith provides the richest and most immediate source of it, they are shunned by most civilized communities. As a result, vampires tend to live in the fringes of society if they participate in it at all. So there you have the vampire. It's got a little bit of vampire-esque stuff, so, drinking blood is the best way to get essence into your undying system. So, you got the blood drinking thing. But the rest of the, I would say, tropes of vampirism are not here. But this is the first stage of the undead. You're a vampire, and so you still have a lot of your mental faculties. You're still able to enjoy life in a sense. You're still you, but you're aware that you're decomposing. And so at this point, like they see here, some people just resign to it and they decide, screw it, I'm just going to live how I want for whatever time I got left before I lose my mind. Other people, they go off into hiding to try to stave it off as long as they possibly can. A lot of people, obviously, will consume others to try to extend or slow down their dying. I was going to say extend their life, but they're already dead. So I guess slow down their dying, whatever it is you want to call it. That's where this whole process begins. They're an interesting character to get into, and it would be an interesting one to play in a tabletop role-playing game. I'm not really sure how fast this decomposition goes, but I imagine it's not very long, because within days, you can start to see a deceased body reach decomposition of the state of a dargil or a regular ghoul, and we'll actually get into that right away. The dargil is the next stage in this irreversible process of decay. They are Darguls, dargils. Dargils represent the first stage of the irreversible decay of a dead body that is sustained only by soul energy. In this state, dargils have lost some portion of their memories and mental abilities, but still retain enough self-awareness to recognize their own decline. Their hunger for living flesh is so insatiable as to make them reckless. They are more aggressive in their pursuit of kith than even vampires, yet crave secret and secluded environments where they can eat their prey without the inciting wrath of civilized communities. Some vampires dread this stage more than those that follow, for they know they will likely possess enough of their faculties to fully appreciate losing them. So there you have the dargil. So the dargil is that next stage in this process of decay as an undead creature. You have enough memory to recognize who you are, though you're losing memories of what your life was. You're losing grips on who you are, what reality is. You just have this insatiable hunger to consume essence and stay, quote-unquote, alive a little bit longer. But you still have that, it says here in the lore, right? Like, they still have that recollection that I shouldn't be doing this in public. I should go hide somewhere and do it. Both to keep themselves protected, but probably also because there's like, it's just kind of built in. This is a shameful thing. You shouldn't eat people in front of other people, right? So that's the stage of Dargles. And I can see why Vampires would dread this stage over any other, because it sounds like you're just sane enough to realize how crazy you are. It sounds like this would be the part where you have to just endure the fact that you are what you are, and you know the end is coming. The next stage after Dargle is just Gull, Gul. Most hold that Gulls retain enough mental understanding to be canny hunters and adversaries, but not enough to care about the advanced degradation of their once-lived bodies. Like Dargles, they seek secluded environments, though some also gravitate towards cemeteries for the consumable flesh available there. Consuming flesh feeds their hunger for physical nourishment, but it falls short of satisfying their need for essence. Inhabiting a graveyard may actually hasten their decay, since it satisfies a part of their hunger and reduces their incentive to find living sources of food. So the main difference between a Dargle and a Gull is that invisible line in the sand where you know who you are to where you don't. When you're a Gull, you're kind of at this point now where you're just all you are is need to feed, need to feed, need to feed. You don't remember who you are. You don't know what's going on. You're kind of just going on muscle memory. Your body looks a lot more decayed. And actually, when looking at the article on the fandom website, it says that the flesh sags off their bones, they've lost all their hair, and they have become a little more than beasts at this point, just needing the feed, just needing the hunger that they have to feed. They have to just constantly find things to feed. And it seems they don't even have the mental capacity to necessarily recognize what they should or shouldn't feed on. Like, for example, if they go to a cemetery, they're not actually eating that life force, that essence, because there's no living people in a cemetery, right? So they're actually hastening their decay at that point in time, but they're just so instinctual at this point that they don't even recognize what it is they're doing. So that's that when you finally have crossed that invisible boundary from being a Dargle where you still have a little bit left of you to just now you are nothing but instinct, nothing but animal. That's all you are. I should mention as well, Dargles, because these are stages that take place over a period of time, there's typical ways that you see these enemies look. Like we mentioned, Gulls, like the flesh is now sagging on the bones. They lost all their hair. Vampires relatively look like, still relatively alive. They might look like a recently deceased person. So they might have some of that look to them. A Dargle is somewhere in between that. So they're starting to show signs of physical and mental deterioration. But it might not be as overtly obvious. That one's a little bit more of a gray area. We don't know how fast this body is decomposing or anything like that. The next stage before the end is Revenant. Revenants are visibly rotten, the skin having completely rotten away. You can even see muscle underneath that's probably starting to go, and the mind has only base instincts with just the desire to feed, nothing else. Revenants are undead that have devolved beyond even the relative intelligence of a ghoul. Ghouls having relative intelligence in the sense of like they can plan ahead and they can hunt, but they're still just driven to feed. So they have a consciousness, like they can reason in that sense, but they don't have an identity, if that makes sense. Whereas a revenant is nothing. They retain their instinctive hunger, but lack the will or intelligence to reliably satisfy it. They are drawn to any environment where dead or dying bodies can be found. Owing their lack of intelligence and self-sufficiency, revenants are doomed to degenerate into skeletons, though the process can span anywhere from months to decades depending on their environments and the success at finding prey. And so there you have a revenant, which is kind of like this last stage before you become a skeleton. There's nothing left in there mind-wise. You can still consume essence because you still have some form of internal organs, I guess you could say. Although they're probably not internal anymore. They're probably visible at this point. I should probably put a content warning at the start of this episode now that I think about it. There's a lot of gruesome stuff here. But anyways, that's a revenant. So the mind's completely gone. The body is just about there. And it's just try to feed, try to feed, try to feed. And if they're successful, apparently you can go on for decades, this process, before becoming skeletons. And speaking of which, we reach the final stage of this undead chain, the skeleton stage. Skeletons are creatures who no longer require flesh or essence, but whose drive to kill has been instilled over many stages of progressive decay. As a result, they will attack anything that approaches them, but they won't attempt to consume it after it is slain. The essence that animates them is energy at its most basic level, as the skeleton has lost all measure of will, intelligence, or personality. If not killed, a skeleton may eventually grind itself into bone dust, or its essence may finally evaporate into the aether. And so there you go. That's the life of an undead all the way down to a skeleton. I will point this out that on the Wikipedia article, it says that given enough time, the bones will reduce to dust, which the soul will still be bound to. However, in here it says that the bones might be given to dust, or its essence, which is the stuff that's animating this skeleton to be quote unquote alive, may finally evaporate into the aether. So there's a little bit of a contradiction there. I don't know if it is one because it uses the qualifier or in the official lore book. So I suppose there's the potential that a skeleton could grind itself down to bone dust, and then the essence inside of that could still just be stuck and trapped there. So there's some person's soul that's just trapped in a bowl of bone dust somewhere, if people use it for alchemy. It's my inner Skyrim coming out right there. But there you have it. That's what a skeleton is. At the very end of this decaying process, they don't have the means by which to consume things anymore, so they're not really driven to eat. They don't have that urge to consume essence. But they have, at this point, possibly for decades, just attacked anything on sight. And so that is what's sticking with them, because they're just kind of mindless at this point. They're just instinctual, and the only instinct that they've really put into themselves since their vampire stage is attack the thing that's in front of you. And so that's what they do. They see things and they attack it. I'm sure there are ways to make skeletons loyal to you. I know death guards can summon undead in different ways. So there is that. But that's the idea behind skeletons. And so now when you go to play Avowed, you're going to understand what the skeletons are. Or if you go and play Pillars of Eternity for the first time, you see them, now you know what they are.
Is an oath worth the weight of a crown?
So what might this have to do with Avowed? Well, obviously, we're going to be seeing undead in Avowed. I mean, we've already seen them, really, in the gameplay trailer. We've already seen the undead. So unless Obsidian decides to do something really weird and just decide to remove them from the game entirely, it's pretty much a guarantee that we're going to see the undead. And now you understand where they come from, and you can understand the process of decay. And when you run into a vampire, you might understand what's going to happen to them ultimately. This might come to play in a side quest for all we know. You might be roaming through the living lands, and then you break into a shed in the middle of nowhere, and here is a hermit in front of you, and it's a recently deceased person who made themselves into a vampire, and they're just trying to live their own life. They're just trying to stave off the decomposition. They just want to be left alone, etc., etc. But here you have the opportunity to do you put them out of their misery? Do you let them continue trying to stave off the inevitable? What do you do, right? There's an idea for a very small, not even a side quest, really. That's just what do you do in this moment? And with this information I've just given you, now you understand the lifespan of that. And I mean, it doesn't solve the moral quandary of what do you do in that situation, but still, now you at least understand what you're doing. So you go. Now you can make an informed decision. You're welcome. That's what I'm here for. Anyways, so we're going to run into the undead almost certainly, and this is just the knowledge behind it. When you see a skeleton, you can know it was a vampire. When you see a dargle, you can know it's just starting that stage of decomposition. I find it cool to think about where these enemies come from. It's not just skeletons rose out of the ground for no reason. There's it happened for some reason. There's a story behind each skeleton in a way, right? There's a person behind it in some way. And I like that. I like that Obsidian does writing like this, and they make you and I think about things like that. But anyways, this episode has gone long enough for something as simple as the undead creatures and skeletons that we see in video games, but I thought the lore was interesting, and it's related to Avowed, so there you go. If you liked today's episode, send me an email, worldofeora@gmail.com. If you want any updates on the show, follow me on Twitter @worldofeora. I mostly just post updates on when there's new episodes, although lately I haven't even been doing that very much. But if anything else does come down the road, be sure to follow there so you can get the news on it. As for myself, there's nothing really new going on here. I have been getting deteriorating condition on my hands, I think from my job. So I'm going to have to be rethinking how I structure my life as of late. I can't really even play games with joysticks very long anymore, so I guess I'm switching to PC. It's PC for me now. I finished playing Bramble, which apparently was a meme on Reddit for a while, don't sleep on Bramble. And I missed the whole meme because I was gone for a while. But anyways, I did finish Bramble. For those of you who haven't played Bramble, the only thing I will tell you is this. Take the content warnings very seriously. There are a few scenes in that game where you're I really didn't want to see that. So take the content warnings seriously. It is a very dark story to tell. But it's an interesting adventure. I enjoyed it. I'm a big cowardly baby when it comes to scary games, so the fact that I was able to finish this game was happy for me. Granted, I think the third-person perspective and the camera being at a fixed angle helped with that. The folklore of, I think it's Swedish folklore, is really cool. I'm into that kind of stuff, and it was neat to do research and talk with other people about that outside of the game itself. Anyways, that's everything for today's episode. Thanks everyone for listening. I've been your host, Eric, aka Gingerino, and I'll see you guys next time.